The purpose of today's video is to cover Iran's legislative branch, which frequently my students find confusing. So to start off with, Iran has a Majlis. The role of the Majlis is to make laws in accordance with divine law. Since Iran is a theocracy, it's important for their legislative branch, the Majlis, to make laws that are going to be deemed as corresponding with and upholding Islamic law. So first of all, it's a unicameral body. The members serve 4-year terms. It approves appointments to the Guardian Council. It can pass legislation. It oversees the budget. It can approve and remove cabinet members. And you do not have to be a cleric to be elected. Okay? And some seats are reserved for ethnic minorities. Okay? So the Majlis gets to pass laws and has a lot of powers that are similar to legislative bodies in other countries that we have studied, even including the United States. But because they have to make laws that are in accordance with divine law, and the people who can be elected to the Majlis do not necessarily have to have expertise in Islamic law, that means that there need to be other bodies to make sure that the Majlis is actually following Islamic law correctly. Okay? In Iran, because it's a theocracy and sort of upholding Islamic law is the most important thing, the Majlis, if it conflicts with one of these other bodies, the Majlis never wins. Okay? The most conflict area that the Majlis gets in with other bodies is in terms of the budget, because that is an area that does not deal with Islamic law, and so therefore they can actually have some influence or say. Next, we're going to go on to talk about the Guardian Council. The Guardian Council functions like an unelected upper house of parliament. So in some ways, you could compare this to the House of Lords, and you could compare the Majlis with the House of Commons. However, if you are asked on a test whether or not Iran is a unicameral or a bicameral, you want to say unicameral, because the Guardian Council is not a formal part of the legislative branch. It's sort of its own thing. Okay? The Guardian Council gets to determine who can run for office, so they get to vet the list. So in order to run for office, like president, Majlis, etc., you have to be approved by the Guardian Council, which means that if you are running around saying things that are in opposition to Islamic law, you are not going to get approved and you're not going to get to run for office. They monitor elections. So in that way, they're similar to the IFE in Mexico, in that they're making sure that elections are conducted fairly. The Guardian Council is made up of 12 members. 6 are religious clerics and 6 are lawyers. Because remember, they have this ability to sort of oversee the Majlis and to veto legislation, and so they need to be able to review whether or not something is constitutional and whether it complies with Islamic law. So it makes sense that its members are going to be clerics and lawyers. Okay? They also have the ability to advise the supreme leader on matters related to juris guardianship. And so if, for example, the supreme leader wants to consult someone about whether or not something does or doesn't follow the law, like Islamic law, then the supreme leader could turn to the Guardian Council. We also have the Expediency Council. Okay? It advises the supreme leader. All of the members of the Expediency Council are appointed by the supreme leader, and they serve 5-year terms, and its decisions cannot be overturned. Your book compares this to another kind of unelected upper house with powers to restrict the Majlis. And the reason why they say this is because if the Majlis is unable to revise legislation to the Guardian Council's satisfaction, then it's the Expediency Council that helps mediate that. So in that way, it does have some upper house type functions. However, I also like to think of it as sort of a pseudo cabinet and pseudo Supreme Court, in that it provides a similar role to a cabinet like in the United States or some of the other countries that we've looked at, because these are the supreme leader's advisors, and they are picked by the supreme leader. Normally a cabinet is picked by the executive, but also the fact that its decisions cannot be overturned makes it also have some pseudo Supreme Court-like powers, although there is technically another branch for the court system. The last body I want to talk about is the Assembly of Experts. It is an 88 member of Islamic jurists. People are elected to it by popular vote every 8 years. And so this is another elected body. So the Majlis is elected, the Assembly of Experts are elected. Okay? Constitutionally, its mandate is to appoint, monitor, and dismiss, if appropriate, the supreme leader. Now, that rarely happens, both the appointing and the dismissing. It has a leadership council and 6 committees, which meet twice a year. To run, candidates must be masters of Islamic jurisprudence, that means Islamic law. They must pass several written and oral exams, and they must be approved by the Guardian Council. And 5 of the 12 Guardian Council's members are also members of the Assembly of Experts. So there's some continuity between these two bodies. One question that students frequently like to ask me is the supreme leader really supreme? And I think this quote from the Brookings Institute from last year, I found actually from 2016, I find very interesting. It says, although the Constitution assigns the Assembly of Experts the task of monitoring the supreme leader, there are no formal mechanisms, constitutionally sanctioned or otherwise, through which the Assembly can challenge the supreme leader. Reformist politicians have advocated utilizing the Assembly as a check on the supreme leader's authority, but they have made little progress in institutionalizing this ambition. The 2016 race for the Assembly of Experts has seen a record number of applicants, and its limited mandate has taken on a new significance because of Khamenei's age and recent medical problems. It is very likely that the next supreme leader will be drawn from the 5th Assembly of Experts. Still, while the Assembly is tasked with selecting the next supreme leader, other powerful figures and institutions like the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps will likely influence the selection. So think about this. The supreme leader is probably the next one going to come from the Assembly of Experts, and people in Iran get to elect people to the Assembly of Experts. So that shows a degree of democratic input that people get to have, which I think is important to understand. Your book talks about the fact that Iran is an authoritarian government, but I think it's important to understand that there are positions that are elected in Iran's government. The Assembly of Experts, the president himself, and the parliament are all elected. But there are also very influential non-elected positions. I think that understanding how the Iran government system works is frequently confusing for my students. So I found this chart in the Washington Post several years ago, and I think it does a good job of sort of outlining these different bodies so you can get a sense of like how they work together to run Iran. I think it's also important to understand how, so some of these, there is some level of democratic input that people get to give in the Iran presidency, Majlis, Assembly of Experts at the local level, and also in terms of by referendum. Okay. I've got recent examples, or as recent as I can get, of when these things have happened. In terms of the election system, for the president of Iran, they have a 2-ballot system, which means that if on the first ballot, the candidate with the most votes doesn't have a majority, if that candidate doesn't have a majority, then they would just go to the top 2 vote getters and have a second election. They talk about that also in terms of Russia. Also, we have SMD and MMD that are both operating in Iran. SMD, single member districts. Whoever wins a plurality with a cutoff at 25% wins the seat. And if no one gets that majority of at least, of the majority of the votes, then there's a runoff. Okay. There's also MMD, multiple member districts, where voters cast as many votes as there are seats. And if a candidate gets a third of the vote, then they will win the seat. Otherwise, again, there can be a runoff election. And all elections in Iran happen through direct elections. They don't have any wackadoodle electoral college. So lastly, how do I keep these legislative bodies straight? My students frequently get them confused. First of all, flashcards are your friends. I have created a Quizlet, which I've shared with you on Canvas, and I will totally be honest that I've spent a lot of time having to review these terms myself, and so flashcards can help. The second thing that can help is to make a double bubble chart. Sit down with your notes from this presentation and compare and contrast. How are the Assembly of Experts and the Majlis similar and different? How are the Guardian Council and the Expediency Council similar but different? How are the Assembly of Experts and the Guardian Council similar but different? It's through that comparing and contrasting and that sort of repetition of thinking, what do they have in common and what do they have as differences, that's going to take this information and put it into long-term storage in your brain. So then when you're writing an FRQ or writing or answering multiple choice, you'll be like, I have that information upstairs. Good luck.